Good afternoon. It is 1 o'clock, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, February the 10th, 2021. The weather outside is cold, windy, cloudy, and I'm sure this is not a very good meteorological term, but it is just yucky. And we want to say a very special welcome to Hulsey Middle School. Thank you for joining us today. If there's anyone else that's watching and you haven't signed up, would you please go to www.tiny.cc/EEC register, sign up. This is just for our records, nothing else. Today we're going to do adaptations of plants. During this virtual field trip, students will examine organisms or their structures and use dichotomous keys for identification, explain variation within a population or species, identify some changes in genetic traits that have occurred over several generations through natural selection and selective breeding. The keys were brought to you by Ms. Ramirez. Mr. Broughton will tell you about variation among species and populations. Ms. Fuller will talk to you about changes in genetic traits. Students, this is a virtual field trip, so you cannot ask us direct questions. You can, however, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC /question/answer and send us a question, and we'll do our very best to answer it. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you all about using the key.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about dichotomous keys and how to use them. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and we'll start our presentation. And it might take just a second to get that screen share going. And let me pull up my presentation. So we're going to be learning about dichotomous keys today. So a dichotomous key, what that word means, if we break down the word dichotomous, it means divided or cut into two parts. So a dichotomous key is simply a key or a tool used to identify an unknown organism. And identifying organisms helps scientists to understand an area's biodiversity and document any changes. So again, dichotomous keys are just used for identification of organisms. Now, there is some debate over who created the first dichotomous key. So some people believe it was a French naturalist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he actually created the first text-based dichotomous key, and that was in 1778. However, some scientists actually think the creator was an Englishman named Richard Waller, and he actually created a pictorial version of a dichotomous key, and that was about in 1689. So here you see an example of Richard Waller's version of a dichotomous key. He used pictures for his identification tool versus Lamarck, who used a textual form. So let's take a look at some examples of dichotomous keys. And I'm pretty sure even if you haven't used a dichotomous key to help you identify an organism, you've probably seen dichotomous keys used in other ways. So I remember when I was in high school, everyone liked to read like 17 magazine or Cosmo magazine. And they would have these flow charts or a different form of a dichotomous key in there. So here's just a fun introduction to dichotomous keys using a flow chart form. So here we're just going to do one really quick. This is for what is your spirit animal, just so you can see an example of how these keys are used. So when you're starting your dichotomous key, you always start at the very top or at the very first question. And remember we said dichot means broken into two. So you're always going to be given a set of two choices that you're going to have to answer. So for example, if we take a look at this dichotomous key on the left, the first question, again, you always start with the first question, is do you like being around big groups of people? And again, it's either a yes or a no in this form. So I'm going to say no because I'm a shy person. I don't like big groups. So if I answer no, I'm just going to follow the flow chart down, and it brings me to my next question. And it says, am I bad at waking up in the morning? Yes or no? I'm going to say I am pretty bad at waking up in the morning. I don't like waking up. especially on weekends. I sleep in pretty late, so I'm going to say yes. So I follow the key on down. The next question says, do I like to play video games? I'm going to say no on that. So I'm going to follow the no arrow. And it says, do you procrastinate at work? I'm going to say no to that. So I'm going to follow my arrow down. And finally, it comes to an end point, and that end point will be your answer. So in this case, it says my spirit animal would be a wolf. So that's just one example of how a dichotomous key flows. You start at your first question, you answer it. It's going to be a set of either yes or no questions. And depending upon how you answer, you just follow your way down the chart. And then here's another one that you guys can do on your own time. It's from Disney, and it just says, you know, who's your Disney spirit animal? So those are some fun ways that you've probably seen dichotomous keys used. So now let's look at an example of how scientists actually use them to identify organisms. So here we have a picture of an unknown tree, and this tree is behind my classroom. So make some quick observations. Notice the color, the size, the shape of this tree. Also look at the close-up version of the leaves of the tree, and you're going to have to examine it in good detail and make some good observations. So here's a scientific form of a dichotomous key, and this one happens to be a text version with a yes/no prompts. So we always start at question number 1. So question number 1 is circled already for us. So question number 1 says, does this plant grows on trees or plant grows differently? So this tree obviously does not grow on another tree. So we're going to say that this plant grows differently. So if we follow our little dotted line, it tells us go to 3. So now our next step is we just follow the steps. So we're going to go to question number 3. So we're going to jump down. Question number 3 again gives us 2 options. So is this tree, does it have leaves that are small and clumped together that look like a green rat tail, or does it have leaves that appear differently? So what do you guys think? So hopefully if you look at this close-up view of our leaf system, you can see that this actually looks like 3A. So leaves small and clumped together, and it kind of looks like a rat tail. So all we have to do, we come over to the other side, and there are no more go-to steps. It actually gives us a name this time. So we've actually found our organism name, and that lets us know that this organism is a type of juniper tree. So this one happened to be super easy because we didn't have to go through that many steps. But the key point is when you're doing dichotomous keys, you always start at number 1. And sometimes there might be words that you don't know. So you might have to do some research on what some of these words mean and what some of these parts are. It's also important to note that it just so happened that this dichotomous key actually had my organism in it, but not all dichotomous keys will have your organism answer in there. So you might have to refer to other dichotomous keys or even use field guides or other resources to help you with your identification. So there's one specimen. Let's look at our next specimen. So this is another plant that was outside our facility. So make some careful observations. And we're not identifying the tree here. Instead, we're identifying the growths that are on top of the tree. And this tree was covered in these green plants. So we're trying to figure out what all of these green plants are. And notice those plants are green compared to the actual tree structure itself. So again, we're going to start at question number 1. So question number 1 says, does it grow on trees or does it grow differently? So we can tell from the picture that this plant actually grows on trees. So it tells us go to question 2. So we're going to go to question 2. Again, 2 options. Question 2 says, does this plant have leaves that are thick and leathery and it's a parasite on trees, or does this plant have leaves that are thin and silvery? Now, if you have your video going, I'm going to try and put this up to the camera so that you guys can see it. This right here, if I touch it, it actually has really thick leaves, and they do feel rather leathery. So I'm going to say that this would be a yes to, where am I at? Oops. A yes to 2A. So, and again, a short step, it actually gives us our name, mistletoe. So we can identify the growths on this plant as mistletoe, and mistletoe is indeed a parasitic organism. It actually can undergo photosynthesis, but it also utilizes nutrients from its host tree, and it will actually siphon or suck out the nutrients and water from the tree that it's growing on. So mistletoe is a pretty cool parasite. And then also you might be familiar with mistletoe because during the winter holidays, during Christmas, you might see hanging up and the adults would kiss under it. So that is mistletoe. And then let's take a look at another type of dichotomous key. So this one's going to be a virtual dichotomous key that's online. So before we go to the virtual dichotomous key, take a moment to review and observe very carefully the specimen that we have right here. And I'm going to show it up to the camera so that you can see it. We actually have a lot of this out here at the Environmental Center, and it's so beautiful during the winter time because most of the trees have lost their leaves, but this shrub or tree still has nice, beautiful green leaves and these red berries. So as you're making your observations, you can use this diagram on the left to help you with your descriptions. So when we talk about venation of a leaf, we're talking about the little veins that you guys can see in the leaves right here. So if we take a look at the veins in this leaf, do you think they are pinnate, parallel, or palmate? So palmate just means like if you have your hand and then it kind of radiates out from the center point. So think of a palm. So if we take a look at our leaf here, we can actually tell that it has pinnate venation. So you can see that main central vein, and then it has these little veins coming out of it. And then think of the shape of the leaves. Also think about the arrangement and the margins. So for the shape of the leaves, this one's kind of like an oval shape. And the arrangement, this has a simple arrangement. So you can see there's only one leaf coming out from the main stem. The margins means what does the edge of the leaf look like? So the edge of the leaf kind of has like these little, kind of like a little dull serration. So it's not a sharp edge, but it does have a little lobed edge to it. And then the arrangement on the stem. So if you take a look at the stem here, and then look at the leaves coming out of it, the leaves are alternating in their direction. So this has an alternate stem arrangement. So now that we have some of those characteristics down, I'm going to see if I can minimize this screen and pull up the image again. So this is Trees of Texas, and it's from Texas A&M Forest Service, and it's an online dichotomous key. So here's how this one works. So here's our set of options. It says my tree has, and then there's a series of 8 options. So does this tree have leaves that are very large and fan-shaped? Are they feather-like? Are they needle-like? Are they scale-like? Are they compound and opposite? Are they compound and alternate? Or are they simple and opposite, or simple and alternate? So again, take a look over here. Now, again, we said that this particular specimen has leaves that are simple because it's just one leaf coming out from each of those little twigs. And they're also alternate because they're alternating in their direction. So we're going to click on leaves are simple and alternate. And now we have a new set of options that we're going to choose for. And this set of option is pertaining to the leaf shape. So take a look at the options that are given and see which leaf shape best fits our specimen. So I'm going to say that the leaf shape that best fits our specimen is probably going to be leaves are oval. So I'm going to click on the leaves are oval. And now we have another new set of options. And this time it's talking about the margin, those end edges of the leaf. So take a look at the options given and compare it to our specimen. Which option do you think best closely resembles our specimen? Is it the spiny edge, the bluntly or remotely toothed edged, the coarsely toothed, the double tooth, the finely toothed, or entire, meaning there's no little edges there? So I'm going to say it looks most closely like this one, the edge bluntly or remotely toothed. And then the last one is asking about the actual size of the leaf. I know you aren't here to measure it, but they're actually quite small. So these leaves are evergreen and they're about 1 to 2 inches long. So they're on the smaller end. And then, so I click that and now I have no more options. Now it actually comes to the point where it's identified my specimen. And it says that this one happens to be Yopon. and that is Ilex vomitoria. And that indeed does look like my specimen that I have here. So this was actually a pretty cool specimen. It's beautiful during the wintertime because it is an evergreen tree. So while most of the trees have lost their leaves, this is an evergreen, so it stays green for the most part of the year. It has these beautiful red berries, and this tree is dioecious. So what that means is the male and female parts are on different trees. So if it has berries, that lets me know that this one is actually a female tree. And those berries are actually important for birds during the wintertime. They use them for food. And something interesting about this one, Yopon leaves actually contain a small amount of caffeine, and the Native Americans actually used the leaves and the twigs to make a type of tea drink out of it. And how do you think it got the name vomitoria? So it says over here that the Native Americans have used this ceremonially as a purgative called the black drink, thus providing the source for the Latin species name vomitoria. So I thought that was an interesting little fact. So now we're going to pull back our PowerPoint and continue moving on. So we did observe that. If you would like to go home and observe and identify trees and leaves at your school or at home, again, you can visit the Texas A&M Forest Service Trees of Texas Dichotomous Key online, and there's a link provided for you guys there. So dichotomous keys can take all sorts of forms and shapes. They might consist of pictures, they might consist of yes and no questions that you might have to answer, or they might consist of statements that will tell you where to go next depending on your answer. So the last thing that I have for you guys is a quick dichotomous key challenge. See if you can identify the leaves in this diagram. And I know it's a lot to identify all of them, but try to at least identify this cool, interesting leaf here that is circled in red. So use a dichotomous key to help you guys out. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share, and that is all I have for you guys for dichotomous keys. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. Oh, that's an interesting way. Somebody's put a lot of work into making life a little bit easier for us if we want to identify anything. Now, the question is, why use the dichotomous key? In biology, classification plays a major role. New species are being discovered daily. It is important to be able to identify and classify them. The dichotomous key helps us to identify new and old organisms. Now, we're going to hear from Mr. Broughton, and variation in species and population.
Thank you, Dr. Gorman. Let me share my screen here to get us started. There we go. And we are going to talk about variation in terms of variation within a population of trees. And I'm going to focus on just oak trees for this presentation. They have different external characteristics that help them survive where they live. And so you can see in this first picture here are some oak trees. I believe those are live oak trees, but there are about 60 different types of oak trees that are native to North America. And actually 50 of those varieties are native to Texas. So we do have a lot of oak trees in Texas, and we have them here where we work at the Environmental Education Center, and they are in Dallas. If you've been anywhere in Dallas, you have probably seen an oak tree. And they are very important for the wildlife because they provide acorns, which squirrels and deer and other animals need to eat, especially during the wintertime when they can't find other food. They provide habitats for many animals, and even after they die and even if they fall down, they still are providing habitats for animals as they decay, because they do take a long time to decay. They're a harder wood, and so they provide homes even after they are dead for animals. But let's move into our first variety of oak trees. It's the post oak. Again, those are important for wildlife because of the acorns they produce. If it weren't for post oaks, where we work out here at our center, we wouldn't have a lot of the wildlife that we do have out here, like squirrels and deer and wild hogs and other animals that do rely on those acorns. These trees grow very slowly. They have a shallow root system, which means it's not deep in the ground, but they grow out along the surface of the ground, underground because of roots, but not deep down. They prefer dry, sandy soil. I'm going to show you a picture of the soil we have in our post oak preserve in just a minute. They don't need a lot of water to survive. They tolerate heat well, which makes them very well adapted to our area out here. We get some really hot summers every summer and some almost drought-like conditions every single summer, if not a drought. And these trees do just fine in those conditions. They do not grow super tall, and 50 feet is not that tall for a tree. And the diameter of their trunk is about 2 feet. And then you can see here, this is what their leaf looks like and what the acorn looks like, which is a pretty typical acorn if you've seen one of those. The post oak is very, very common in Texas. In fact, you can see right here, there's a whole ecoregion of Texas called the post oak savanna. It's this lighter blue area, kind of east of us. This is Dallas County right here. And the post oak savanna is a little farther east, but we do have post oaks in Dallas County. They're just not as prevalent as in this ecoregion. We are actually in the Blackland Prairie ecoregion of Texas. And if you were wanting to find out where some post oaks are, right here is the Post Oak Preserve. That is right across the street from where we work out in Seagoville. This preserve has a lot of post oaks in it. That's why it's called the Post Oak Preserve. And if you live somewhere else in Dallas, like maybe you go to school, if like Halsey is kind of more over this way. No, I'm sorry, like right in here-ish. Maybe this preserve would be worth visiting, or the Cedar Hill area preserves would be a little closer to you, or you could come on a field trip to us. We're not that far from you. Someday when you can come in person and see the post oaks we have here. And I'll actually escape out of this and show you the website that you can use to find all of the preserves in Dallas County. The county started establishing these preserves in 1976. There are 21 preserves in Dallas County, and the reason they started these preserves was to give plants and animals a place to live. If it weren't for these preserves, we'd probably have homes and businesses in those areas, but we have to leave some space for wildlife too. So Dallas County did those preserves, and they're not like a normal park. If you go to a neighborhood park, there might be a playground or a soccer field or something like that. They left these as natural as they could. There might be some hiking trails or biking trails that go through them, but they're more like a state park, so the animals can live there too. And our Post Oak Preserve over here in Seagoville is one of the largest preserves in the county. It's 335 acres, and it's also one of the oldest in the county too. I think this is one of the first ones to become a preserve. But I'm going to get back into our presentation here, because I'm actually going to take you on a virtual hike through our preserve. It usually takes, I would say about an hour to walk all the way back to a lake in our preserve, and then and back. But we're going to do this in a little less than 3 minutes because of time lapse. So enjoy a little quick, about 2.5, 3 minute video of our Post Oak Preserve. And there was supposed to be some audio with this, but I'll just have to provide it myself. So most of the trees you are seeing are post oaks. The evergreen ones are those junipers, or sometimes they're called red cedars, that Mr. Mears identified in a dichotomous key. we have other trees out there as well. There's some elm trees and some hickory trees, some American beautyberry trees. But most of the trees that you're seeing as we kind of zoom through this trail are post oaks. So you can see that they're deciduous. They've lost their leaves to the winter. I did this video, I think just last week. So it's pretty much exactly what it looks like right now. And it's difficult to see the forest floor from this video, but it is a sandy forest floor that does not retain a lot of water. But that's what kind of allows these post oaks to thrive in this area. It's the perfect soil for them. And I think we're about back to the lake. So you might see in a minute here the lake through the trees. And when we go down actually to the lake, you'll see that the soil gets very, very sandy there. It should be here in just a minute. And again, the bumpiness is because we were driving one of our little gators back to this lake, and so every time you hit a bump, it shakes. And then I sped it up too, so we don't have to spend too long watching a video. But now you can see the lake in the background there, and we're gonna head up towards it in just a minute here. And there you can see how the ground was very sandy as we got right up to that lake. So there is our post oak preserve. And I think this next picture, well, we're not going to watch that again, is a soil core sample we took out of the post oak preserve. So most of the forest floor is covered in leaves. A lot of these are post oak leaves, like I believe this one here is a post oak leaf. But if we use this tool here to take a core sample of our soil, the very top has some dark, more like humus type soil, but that's probably just, I mean, a 1 inch layer of that soil. And underneath that is a sandy soil. And the post oak trees like that because they prefer that dry, kind of drier, sandy soil to grow in. So that was the post oak. Another oak variety that we have in our preserve, not very many of them, but we do have some, are the blackjack oak. And they also don't grow in the greatest soil. But it allows them to thrive. They have a slow growth rate like a post oak, but they do not do very well in the shade. And if you noticed in that, a lot of the area when we were doing that virtual hike through the post oak preserve, had a lot of shade, so they struggle to grow there. They do well if there's been a fire. They're one of the first trees to occupy an area following a fire, which makes them a pioneer species. So after a fire, if everything's been destroyed, you will get a succession that will happen. Grasses will start growing, smaller plants, but you will probably see blackjack oaks. I don't know why I can't say that word today. Growing there first. And why that is because they have a very thick layer of bark. That's one of their external features that helps them thrive. And it protects sprouts that are inside that, or buds, that are inside that bark. And so after it burns, those buds have been protected by that very thick, very protective bark, and they will sprout after a fire and allow that tree to come back. So they can reshoot their buds faster than other trees, and in spite of a fire. In fact, fire almost helps them thrive because it gets rid of trees that would put them in the shade. It can grow a little bit taller than a post oak tree and about have the same size diameter of trunk, but they're usually much smaller. They're not a very large tree. These are in fact, the smallest of the oak trees that I'm going to show you today. And here is a picture of a blackjack oak. It's hard to see in this picture, but here is some post oak trees, but this one right here is a blackjack oak tree that's in our preserve. So you can see that that diameter of that trunk is definitely not 2 feet. And the height is definitely not 60 feet. It was probably more like between 20 and 30 feet only. And there's a little closer picture up. So these are post oak trees here, and there's that blackjack oak. You can see its bark is different than a post oak, and it's a thicker bark. It's a hardier bark and can withstand fire better than a post oak can. So it's if we were to have a fire there, this tree would end up doing better. But thankfully, we haven't had any major fires in this preserve in many years. And then there's the leaves of the blackjack oak. They're a different shape than a post oak leaf. I'm going to show you the actual leaves here after this presentation. And they usually do fall to the ground. These just haven't fallen yet. That tree is not as tall as these post oak trees. So it's a little bit protected from the wind, and the wind hasn't been able to blow these dead leaves off of it yet. So that's the only reason they haven't fallen. It's just a little more protected from the wind, being shorter than the rest of the trees in the preserve. And then we also have out here a bur oak. They are native to the grassland prairies of Central and West Texas. You will find them around the Dallas area. They grow a little bit faster than post oaks and blackjack oaks. And what makes this bur or oak tree unique is that it has a very deep taproot system. So the post oaks and the blackjack oaks have that shallow root system. This tree grows a deep taproot way down into the ground that, once it's established, makes it very drought tolerant. So it's a drought tolerant like those other two oaks, but using a different adaptation, which is that taproot. And this tree gets to be a lot taller than a post oak or a blackjack oak. It can get to be 100 feet tall. The trunk is much thicker than those other trunks, more than twice as thick. And the acorns are much bigger than a post oak acorn or a blackjack acorn. The acorns of the bur oak are about the size of a golf ball. So if you ever had one growing in your yard, you definitely would not want to make some kind of driveway underneath that oak tree, because when the acorns fall, they could actually dent your vehicle. Like if a golf ball hit your vehicle, it could dent your vehicle. They're a lot bigger. But animals still eat them, so they will usually get picked up by animals once they fall. You just don't need it to fall in your car first. And there's the picture of the bur oak at our center. If you've ever been here, the bus pulls up to our main building, and you see to the west our barn, and in front of that barn is this giant bur oak tree. And we have it far enough away, and we don't park vehicles like right here, that it's safe. It does lose all its leaves in the winter, like the other oak trees, like the post oak or the blackjack oak do. But it's a much taller tree than those other ones we looked at. It's a great big oak tree, and it's pretty impressive. And we have that kind of highlighted here, so students, you can't help but walk past it from going from our center to the barn there. And then the last oak tree that I'm going to show you this afternoon is the live oak. They are semi-evergreen rather than deciduous. And what that means is they do keep their leaves until the very end of winter, then they lose them, but then they grow new leaves right back again. So they almost always do have leaves. And that's how they got their name, live oak, because they never look dormant. They keep their leaves pretty much all year round. They again are a slow growing tree. In fact, they take a long time to grow. Some of these live oak trees could be more than 1,000 years old. But they have that shallow root system like the post oak and the blackjack oak. They don't require a lot of water, and they tolerate heat well. So that's kind of something that all of these oak trees have in common, even though they do have different characteristics. This oak tree is unique in that it doesn't get very tall, but it can spread out 100 feet across. So, I mean, it might only grow 50 feet this way, but from the end of this branch to the end of this branch is 100 feet. So they're a pretty amazing tree that way, in that they can grow so wide, but not that tall. And then one other interesting characteristic of this tree is that it produces a chemical which prevents plant growth nearby, thanks to an adaptation called allelopathy. So if you ever try to plant anything underneath this tree, it's going to have a real tough time growing because of that chemical that the tree produces. But also it's going to, that whatever plant is going to be growing here is going to constantly be in shade from these huge branches that spread out 50 feet away from the trunk. If we're just talking like the radius of the tree. You won't see a lot of living things underneath this tree. It's kind of using all of the resources that is provided for it there by the soil for itself. And here's a picture of downtown Dallas. There's live oak trees growing there. So if you've ever been downtown, you probably saw some live oaks. They're all over Dallas. These are not very big yet, but they are growing. They're slow growing. So who knows how they'll look in 100 or 200 years. They may even have to remove them if they get too big, or you can see they've trimmed branches on these to get them to grow the way they want them to downtown. And then here's another picture of live oaks. I don't believe this is even in Texas. They grow all throughout the southeastern United States. They thrive from Texas all the way to Georgia. And so I can't remember where this picture comes from, but I don't think this is even Texas. But they're kind of a pretty tree. They grow them in parks a lot because they provide such great shade to stay out of the summer heat. If you're at a park and different places like that. There's another picture of some live oaks. I like them because they kind of have those leaves almost growing on their branches. You know, they get so green that way. They're a pretty tree and a good tree to have because, again, they don't need a lot of water. So if it's dry, they're gonna survive. Other trees just cannot survive in it through a drought, but live oaks can. And then here's one last picture of a live oak. This is back in Texas. This is in Rockport, Texas. And this is one of the oldest, if maybe not the oldest, live oak tree in Texas. That tree is 1,200 years old. So that's very old. It's almost hard to imagine that this tree started growing 1,200 years ago, but it did. And if you ever are in Rockport, Texas, you can go visit it, but you can see they've kind of got it protected by a fence and they've got a little sign that tells you about it. But they don't want people climbing on this tree and things like that because it is so old, and they're trying to keep it alive as long as they can. So that is it for my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, but I do have some leaves to show you. So here is a post oak leaf. And if I show you, there's the blackjack oak leaf. You can see there's a clear difference between these two leaves. So that might help you identify which type of oak you're looking at. If you're wondering, is it a post oak or a blackjack oak? And they're about the same size, but they're just a different shape. If I put the blackjack oak leaf away and take out the Bur Oak leaf, and I'm even going to have to it's kind of folded over, but it's quite a bit bigger than the post oak leaf. I would say like twice the size of it, because that Bur Oak the tree is about twice the size of the post oak tree. And then I could not find any of the post oak acorns, because I think all the deer and squirrels have gotten them, but here is a Bur Oak acorn. I could only find one of it, and it is about the size of a golf ball. So a pretty large acorn, and I could only find one of these outside right now because I think the animals have gotten the rest. So there you can see kind of how oak trees have adapted in different ways. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Broughton. And the question is, what is my favorite oak tree? And I love all these trees out here, all these beautiful trees, but I'm going to have to go with the live oak tree because 17 years ago, I planted 13 of them in my yard, down my driveway and then across the yard in different places. And as Mr. Broughton explained to you, they do spread very widely. Now, I did not read the directions very well. I was in a hurry, and said to plant them at least 75 feet apart, more like 100 feet. And I did not do that. I planted them about 35 feet apart. And now here 17 years later, I have a bunch of trees that are all growing together. It's a beautiful walkway or driveway down through my driveway because they all touch each other. But I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years because I didn't follow the instructions, but they're beautiful trees. The squirrels love the acorns. They make a lot of very small acorns, but they love them. Thank you so much, Mr. Broughton, for showing that demonstration to us, especially the oak trees to us. And now Ms. Fuller is going to tell you about identification changes and genetic traits.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about identifying changes in genetic traits in apples that have occurred over several generations through both natural selection and selective breeding. So let me very quickly, oops, not that one. Let me very quickly share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So natural selection and selective breeding, changes in genetic traits. And as you know, because of DNA, we've discovered the genome of or mapped the genome of the human person. But we also have mapped the genome of both plants and animals. So let's start off with apples. This is the Red Delicious apple. It was a volunteer. It was discovered in 1870 in Peru, Iowa, and it was called the Hawkeye, and it's got some real distinctive characteristics. It's top heavy. The top part's real big and it tapers to the bottom. It's got 5 points on the bottom. And it has been the most popular apple in the United States for over 50 years. Even though they had the original, it was a volunteer, they didn't come up with it at a university. They have improved it through selective breeding by making it redder and redder. So a lot of people, when they think of apple, they think of the Red Delicious. They also bred it so that it would travel well, so that you could send it across the country. And unfortunately, while they were doing that, they did not breed it for flavor. So it doesn't have a distinctive sweetness. It does have a lot of sugar in it. It's about 19 grams of sugar in it. But I'm losing my train of thought here. It was a volunteer apple that was improved by selective breeding. Okay, let me go to the next one. The Honeycrisp. Now the Honeycrisp, this particular apple, it's a cultivar. Now what you say, well, what's a cultivar? Cultivar is a plant variety that's been produced in cultivation by selective breeding. So this was designed and bred by the University of Minnesota. It's the state fruit of Minnesota. And what they did was they bred it for long cell growth so that when you bite into it, it's very juicy. It's also a very, very sweet apple. And it's the 5th most grown apple in the United States, but the 3rd most grown cultivar. In other words, one that was designed by a nursery or a university. Okay, and they're self-sterile, so it has to be crossbred with a pollinizer, a different kind of apple. And this is a hybrid of 2 apples, the McCowan and the Honeygold. And the Honeygold itself is a hybrid of the keepsake apple times the Minnesota 1627, which is an unreleased apple from the University of Minnesota. All right, let's go to the next one. The Sweet Tango, it is a hybrid of the Honeycrisp and the Zest Star. It was designed in 2008. And it is crunchy and sweet, and that's the kind of apple you eat out of hand. Then we have the Cosmic Crisp. This is the big one that's been released very recently. It's a result of 20 years of research, and it's a cross between the Enterprise and the Honeycrisp. And it's a large, round, crisp, super juicy, sweet, bicolor apple, and it's good for both eating out of hand and baking. Okay, the next one is the Golden Delicious. I don't have one of those to show you, but this is it's not closely related to the Red Delicious, but this is like the third most popular apple in the United States. And it like the Hawkeye, the original Red Delicious, was a chance seedling. And it was discovered in Clay County, West Virginia. And this apple is the state fruit of West Virginia. It was discovered somewhere around the 1900. And in 2010, the genome of this apple was mapped out. It has 57,000 genes. Now, they're still working on all the genomes of different plants, but so far, this Golden Delicious has the most genes, greater than any plant that they've mapped so far. It's sweet, it's yellow, and it's prone to bruising. And okay, and then the next one is the Granny Smith. And the Granny Smith was also a volunteer. This is from Australia. This was from Australia originally, and it was discovered by a lady named Ann Smith, and she was a grandmother, and they called her Granny, so they named it after her. And it's thought to be a cross between the European wild apple and Malus pumila, they think is the pollinizer. They really don't know. It's hard, it's got green skin, it's tart, it's acidic cooking apple. When you think apple pie, this is probably the apple they use because it holds its shape after when it's baking. And it must be grafted. All trees, all Granny Smith trees today are clones of the original tree. You can't plant the seeds of one and then get a true Granny Smith from that. Okay, the Braeburn, I don't have a Braeburn, but I believe I've got a Jazz. And let's see, I've lost my notes on the Braeburn. But anyway, the Braeburn has a genetic defect called Browning disorder. So they started doing selective breeding of the Braeburn in order to get rid of the Browning disorder. And they came up with this apple. It's called the Jazz, and it's a real good to eat out of hand apple. So that's the Jazz apple. Okay, Rocket. These Rocket apples are amazing. They're very tiny. They're the right size for a kid to put in your lunchbox. The Rocket apple was developed in New Zealand, and this is one of those plants that was a cultivar. It was designed and bred to be tiny like this. They are small, crunchy, and they are very sweet. And it's a cross between a Gala and a Gala Splendor. And it was bred to appeal to kids. A kid would have a very difficult time eating this during your 30-minute lunch period, but you can eat one of these very quickly, and it's a really good way to encourage children to eat fruit. So the Rocket apple's amazing. It's very sweet. And the last one we're going to talk about is Sugar Bee. The Sugar Bee is not a cultivar like the Rocket. The Sugar Bee was a volunteer. It was discovered in Minnesota in the 1990s. It's a relatively young apple by a guy named Chuck Nystrom. And they think it's a cross between a Honeycrisp and some unknown variety. It's very sweet, it's crisp, and the patent was bought by Chelan Farms in Washington State. So the ones you buy at the store will not be from Minnesota. They'll be from Washington State. So there we go. So if you have any questions about, let's see, if If you have any questions about selective breeding, I do want to tell you a couple of words. One is the word hybrid that results from cross-pollination of two cultivars. And the first hybrid plant was created by Thomas Fairchild. And then grafting. I mentioned that all Granny Smith trees are from a graft, a clone of that original tree in Australia. And grafting is the process of joining two plants together to grow as one. If you have any questions, Dr. Gorman would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Fuller. First off, I have a statement. My dog requires a half an apple cut up in his dog food both morning and evening. He likes the Gala apples that I can buy at H-E-B. And if I don't put them in there, he just sits there and looks at the bowl and looks at me like you forgot something. So I'll cut his apple up and put it in there. Now, do we use selective breeding at the Environmental Center? Another question. And yes, we have. We used an Angus cow. Angus has the best tasting beef. And we used a Longhorn bull. The Longhorns have the most nutritious beef, but it doesn't taste too good. So we crossed the two together to see if we can get a more healthy and a better tasting meat. However, our little baby is Oreo, a little black and white young lady, and we'll never find out because there's no way that she'll ever be eaten. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to share my screen. This program was about adaptation of plants. During this virtual field trip, students examined organisms or their structure, and they used the Dichotomous Key for identification, explained variation within a population of species, and identified some changes in genetic traits that have occurred over several generations through natural selective and selective breeding, which we just discussed. Ms. Ramirez did the program on the keys. Mr. Broughton, I'm sorry, that's twice, did variation, and Ms. Fuller told us about apples and changes in genetic traits. Thank you so much for joining us today. You guys get warm and stay warm because it's going to really be cold. And we want to thank you for joining us. And we want you teachers, if you would, to go in on to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and fill out a very short form and send back to us to let us know how we did. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great life.